Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, Keeping the Decarbonized Lights On, U.S. Housing, Equity, and the Energy Transition. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that next Thursday at noon, the Joint Center and the Hastings Center are co-sponsoring an online panel discussion titled Towards New Narratives About Aging in Place, Getting What We Want by Investing in What We Need. This discussion will be both our last event of the semester and the last of a series of panel discussions we've had this fall, focused on key findings from advancing housing and health equity for older adults, pandemic innovations, and policy ideas, a report released earlier this fall by the Joint Center and the Hastings Center. Jennifer Malinsky, who directs the Center's Housing and Aging Society program and oversaw preparation of the report, will be one of the panelists. Nancy Berlinger, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, will moderate. More information about the event, including a registration link and a full list of the panelists, is on our website. Now on to today's presentation. Carlos Martín, our speaker, is project director of the Center's Remodeling Futures program. He's also a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program and a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Accelerating Decarbonization in the United States. Over more than 2 decades, Carlos has done extensive and important research on such subjects as green housing, disaster mitigation and recovery, and innovations in construction. This work is especially notable because Carlos is focused on the connections between the bricks and mortars aspects of housing, as well as its wiring and pipes, and important social challenges, particularly those related to equity. And this has become an increasing focus of work from the Remodeling Futures program. Carlos will speak for about 40 minutes, and then he'll answer questions, which you can pose using Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all your questions. We'll wrap things up at about 1:15 p.m. A video of Carlos's talk, the discussion, and his slides will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. And many of the topics that Carlos will discuss today will be discussed in a variety of upcoming publications, including the 2023 Improving America's Housing Report, which will be released in late March. Carlos, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, David. It's a real pleasure to join you all again today. And I must say, when David and I first talked about this this presentation, we had assumed it was going to be intended for a housing audience. And so I've structured my presentation almost as a primer for the housers in this space. But I'm pretty overwhelmed when I saw the registration list of the number of folks in the energy world, especially in the energy justice world. So thank you all for joining in. I'm happy to have you be part of the housing world, and the more of us, the merrier. But for those of you who are in the energy justice world, I should say that this may be a variations on a theme that you've heard before. The work I'll present today will be a slightly different slice of the cake, synthesizing a lot of the long-term work that the colleagues at the Joint Center for Housing Studies have done on home performance and quality and remodeling, and this includes my colleagues Abby Will and Sophia Wadeen and Reardon Frost. So want to make sure that we're acknowledging all the folks at the good folks at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. But I also want to acknowledge the fact that some of the work I'll be presenting is work that's supplemented by and supported by the U.S. Department of Energy and members of the Remodeling Futures program at the Joint Center for Housing Studies Steering Committee, which includes leading remodelers, product manufacturers, et cetera. I also will be presenting some work that I've been doing with Professor Diana Hernandez at Columbia University and Tony Reams, currently at the U.S. Department of Energy, that is supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and other work that's supported by the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative. So all of that to say is be sure to keep an eye out for that 2023 Improving America's Housing Study that David mentioned, because we'll be seeing a lot more of the findings from this work then. In the meantime, I'm happy to start getting, for the housers that are in the room, I'm happy to start talking to you all about where this presentation takes off from a conversation we had last year, also through the Joint Center's webinar series. And that one was on climate adaptation and housing resilience. And when we speak about, in that discussion, what we talked about were the solutions that were currently in our toolbox for reducing exposures and vulnerabilities in our housing stock from climate change's effects. And I hope I said it back then, but let me repeat it now because it bears repeating. The best way to protect our homes from climate change exposures in the future is by stopping further climate change now. And that's why we're here today to discuss this. So what do we want to talk about first? And that is, of course, the housing's role in the greenhouse gas emissions that are creating the climate crisis. More directly, the continued reliance on fossil fuel-based energy to power our homes that result in the climate change effects that endanger these very same homes. The US total greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 were about 4.9 billion metric tons. That in housing accounts for about 920, excuse me, million. Housing accounts for about 926 million of that. So about a fifth of the US's greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy, the carbon-based fuels that are used directly in housing, as well as the carbon-based fuel that's create the electricity that also supports our housing. And just to give you a sense of where that is, that's where just US homes vie with Japan and Iran for 5th place in global greenhouse gas emissions, just our homes. So that should give you a sense of the scale of and the magnitude of the problem that we have to address. So that's crisis number one. Crisis number two, of course, is the fact that all of these residential energy uses are not equally distributed. Both the homes, the quality of the homes in which energy is used, the types of energy, particular equipment and appliances that are used, as well as other concerns that relate to housing and energy ability to pay. For example, low income. These things are not equally distributed. Let me walk you through this because there's a lot of information on this slide. First, we know that across all US homes, the average per household amount of energy that is used per year is about 77 million BTU, British thermal units. So let me walk you through what we're talking about on this slide in terms of per household versus per square footage. Per square footage gives you a sense of how much efficiency the home uses, right? So overall, the household average is how much total energy the home uses versus how much sort of intensely per the amount of square footage that are in that household. So should come as no surprise, single family detached homes consume the most energy in absolute terms, but are also the most efficient. So that's that second pile of bars that you see next after that overall US homes. Why? Because they're big, they consume a lot of energy, but they also have become the most efficient in how much energy they use. I want to note that small multifamily housing, particularly the 2 to 4 unit homes and mobile homes, remain the least efficient in that pile. Second group of bars that you see, that tenure also factors into how homes are occupied by their owners. It also factors into our energy equations, both how homes are occupied by their owners almost consistently consume more energy than their renter counterparts. And that's across all types of housing, from single family detached through multifamily and mobile homes. Third bar, of course, is that older homes are less efficient. They're gas guzzlers in absolute terms, as well as in intensity. And you see a blip in the 1990s with regard to the total consumption. And that has a lot to do with the fact that homes increasingly were built bigger, and but they became, so the efficiency line still, the trend line is still going down. So even though homes were more efficient, they also became a lot bigger. Fourth group are that smaller homes. So this is the clincher. So the size of house really matters, and most clearly with across all of these factors, with bigger homes consuming massive quantities of energy despite their efficiencies. So these physical traits all map onto demography. I mean, we look at that last group charts. Lower income households likely to live in older and smaller and rented and multifamily homes that are less efficient, but they're still consuming, interestingly enough, less energy overall compared to their wealthier counterparts. So these two challenges are what we're up against. How we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve the lot of our neighbors at the same time. These require simultaneous interventions that are complexly woven challenges because of these two systems, the energy system and the housing system that have produced our current context. Now, both of those have very different histories of inequity in the forms of racism, income disparity, and the resulting effects on access to decent, safe, and affordable, and I would add carbon neutral housing, to paraphrase HUD's old mission. So what we're going to talk about today are trying to answer these 5 questions. Where are we in terms of carbon needs right now in our homes? How can decarbonization become equitable? What actually is home decarbonization? Do we have a sense of what physical interventions there are, and what is the current state of their equity or disparity across different populations? Who's going to do this work to ensure that these actual home decarbonization technologies happen, particularly in low-income communities? And then what policies are moving this change or leading to this transformation that we hope to see? So let's start off with where we're using carbon right now. So I mentioned before that overall US housing takes up about 1/5 of our greenhouse gas emissions, produces about 1/5 of our greenhouse gas emissions. That also comes from the fact that 23% of the total national energy use at last count comes from the residential energy sector and the resulting emissions. So there are 2 big points I want to show on this slide. So what you're seeing are just the residential greenhouse gas emissions from different sources, from sources that are not really used anymore, like coal and biomass, to the sources that are dominant in most homes. And this includes natural gas, petroleum, which includes a wide range of liquefied fuels, heating oils, and propane, and retail electricity. Now, you might think, why is retail electricity included in this file? But so much of our retail electricity actually comes from carbon-based energy production. So that allocation that goes to residential uses is included in this file. So right now we're about 926 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in the country. We peaked at a little over 1.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in about 2005. So, but I want to again make sure that this point is coming clear, that the aggregation of our homes and their placement has played a historically important part in how we've created these various energy sources. So 50% of residences use oil or natural gas energy directly, but through the electric power that also comes, we're adding another 25% of residences that rely on electricity through fossil fuel or coal combustion. So a wide range of homes are actually contributing to this disparity between the carbon-based fuels that we use in our homes currently, and the additional carbon-based fuels that we use to produce the electricity that comes into our homes. So let me give you a sense of this disparity. So the end use energy consumed is that is directly the greenhouse gases that are directly coming from the carbon-based uses within our homes, where the total energy are those pieces that are adding on to all of the electricity that adds on to our energy uses. So it's almost double what you see. And think about this in terms of actual numbers of homes. So over 120 million homes currently exist that are producing these 9.1 quadrillion British thermal units of energy. That's what leads to these greenhouse gas emissions. So electricity is about 4.3 quadrillion BTUs, and carbon fuels right now, just in residences, are about 4.8 quadrillion BTUs. So it's a sizable chunk. On average, for just, if you divide up all of that, those quadrillions of BTUs into our house, the 120 million homes we have, it's about, I said before, 77 million BTUs per home. About 34 BTUs of that is carbon-based. So it's still a sizable amount of work. So even though you've seen this level off of it, there's still a sizable amount of carbon-based fuels that we're using in our homes. So it's absolutely critical to electrify homes to make sure that those specific uses that are burning, combusting carbon-based fuels within our homes is gone. But electrification alone will actually cause more grid problems. For example, if you look at electrification, you could be hurting low-income households, not only in the sticker shock of upfront costs of some of these technologies, but in skyrocketing utility bills. For example, electricity is more expensive than natural gas. So if you electrify without making sure that you're reducing your overall energy consumption, your bills are going to go up. And there's also the likelihood that these same low-income homeowners may be the last customers in a dying fuel supply. So ensuring we make these transitions appropriately is absolutely critical. This also means that we need to basically execute careful surgery when we're selecting what to do next. So when we look at where in our homes we're using these resources, over on the left-hand side of the left-hand pie chart that you see, we look at all energy sources and where most of the fuel is going. Those of you energy folks know these charts by heart at this point. About 44% of our energy is going to space heating. So that's your heating systems for your homes. Additional 90% for water heating, 9% for space cooling or air conditioning, and then this massive other, which includes all your appliances, lighting, refrigerators, a range of other energy uses. If you divvy this up by electricity versus natural gas, just in the residential sector, you see that most of the natural gas is going to space heating, whereas 23% of the electricity we use goes to space heating purposes. So there's a big opportunity there to focus on space heating transition and water heating transition, because that'll encompass the vast majority of natural gas uses in our homes, how we make that and how we make this transition. So that's basically where we are right now. So how do we make all of this equitable? So I talked about the fact that this requires understanding both the histories of the energy system as well as the histories of our housing disparities. So energy equity is multifaceted based on past interactions with energy providers, current disparities in access, disparities in cost, disparity in uses, and the design of future energy beneficial interventions. So there are various papers that I can refer you to talk about what energy equity means in the broader spectrum of how to start quantifying those different aspects of energy. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on a few manifestations of energy inequity in our carbonized housing. And that is not to mean that I don't believe we should not be talking about the relationship between disadvantaged communities and where utilities go in terms to expropriate tribal lands for energy production or to site transmission infrastructure in low-income communities and communities of color. Nor does it mean that we shouldn't be talking about shut-off policies and unfair pricing schemes to low-income households. And a truly equitable intervention would be one that acknowledges and redresses all of those scars. But again, just for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on just current manifestations from the data that we have of energy inequities. And that always starts off with talking about energy insecurity. I'm showing you slides from the 2020 REX energy insecurity. I highly recommend that you all immediately after, not during my talk, go to the blog post that the Joint Center just put up by Reardon Frost yesterday regarding how the differences between using the Pulse survey data, which was conducted by the Census Bureau during the pandemic. It was a much more timely depiction of energy insecurity in relation to the REX data, which was a point in time early in 2020 when there were significant shut-off moratoria that may have reduced that levels of energy insecurity that you'd be witnessing in this data. But in all cases, it's important to note that this figure still displays that there are wide disparities in energy insecurity by income, race, and housing status. Most notable is that families with incomes less than the national average have a 30% rate of energy insecurity compared to 14% of their wealthier counterparts. Native American and Black households in particular suffer these conditions at almost twice the rates than their white counterparts, 52% versus 20%, with Latino and Hispanic households trailing just behind at about 47%. There are similarly disproportionate burdens exist for households with children, renters, and families living in mobile homes and apartment buildings, particularly those apartment buildings that are just the 2 to 4 units that I mentioned. But as I mentioned, energy insecurity is also wrapped into housing inadequacy. And housing inadequacy is the product of a wide range of income challenges, income burdens, as well as the histories of our building of housing and its location in this country. So housing inadequacy is a critical factor in energy hardship. There are correlations between physical housing adequacy and energy insecurity. And this plays out by income and race as well as housing tenure. For example, as you see, energy rates, and remember, energy rates, that what you pay per kilowatt hour, are not prorated based on your ability to pay. So monthly energy costs as a proportion of housing costs are higher for lower income households. And there are patterns by race and age as well, particularly if you see in the middle, the American Indian and elderly households, the second group of bars on the right, suffer disproportionately from experiencing key housing-related energy insecurity, such as experiencing uncomfortable cold for 24 or more hours, or having equipment break down as a cause of the cold experience that they're suffering. So what do low-income households, especially renters, do as a consequence? There are financial consequences, first of all. And in 2021, for example, we know that the majority of low-income renters cut back just on a variety of other critical expenditures just to pay their energy bills. But it's not just financial, there's also a health burden. 27% of all US households experience some form of energy insecurity, like cutting back on food and medicine, leaving their homes at unhealthy temperatures because of their inability to pay. They've created these health hazards, and as well as leading to energy poverty actions. And I recommend everybody read the upcoming publication, book publication by Dr. Diana Hernandez that's going to be talking specifically about these kinds of energy insecurities and their behaviors. But I do want to note that looking at equity is, again, the way I've described inequity is sort of the manifestation of negative energy consequences, including energy insecurity and housing cost burdens in relationship to their utility bills. And that's what a century and a half of intense carbonization has produced. Now we need to think about what the positive aspects of decarbonization can bring in terms of energy interventions that outweigh the negative and that provide services disproportionately to benefit these same households that have received these negative, have suffered from these negative consequences. So again, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm focusing on what the physical boundaries within the home. Now, there are a variety of other important and critical interventions that relate to our housing, for example, transportation costs and uses based on our land use policies, et cetera. But for the purpose of this conversation, let's just stick to these 5 categories of physical interventions that could lead these positive physical interventions to the home. Number 1 is electrification. And so that's simply making sure that something that uses a carbon-based fuel right now in your home, in your house, is switched out. I mean, we all know the induction stoves, the heat pumps, both for space heating and for water heating, that have become common parlance, at least I hope for most of you. But I'm also in the broader study that we're conducting, we're including an electrification in-home EV charging. So not the EV equity itself, for example, access to an electric vehicle and its purchase, and its subsequent reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, but rather whether these who and how homes that will have EV charging stations in them can plug in. The second group is energy efficiency and conservation. And this is the group that has the longest history, going back to the 1970s and going back to the massive work that the U.S. Department of Energy has done in terms of R&D, leading to the weatherization and its weatherization assistance program, as well as the advancing research technologies that have come up with Energy Star for new homes, home performance with Energy Star, and more recently, the DOE Net Zero Ready Homes and Energy Star verified HVAC installations. So this is a wider group of projects that we can speak about, but they're all focused on reducing the overall demand, in some cases tied in with electrification, but the overall demand for energy from our homes, so that not only are you not using carbon-based fuels in your house, but you're also not using electricity, that you're asking for less electricity from the grid that may be supplied by carbon-based fuels. Okay, I've made that point ad nauseum. I'll leave it there. The third conversation I want to have is on digitalization, and that is the collection and analysis of information about your energy use at both the building level and system or equipment level to manage total energy consumption through digital data collection, analytical tools, and controls. And those controls may either be in the power of the occupant or the utility or a third party like an energy efficiency service provider. This intervention is especially important for that retail electric component as well of housing greenhouse gas emissions, since increased electrification would result in an overwhelmed grid. Fourth, distributed renewable energy production. So this is your PV panels on your roof, geothermal, other non-carbon energy production. So, and this may include community level generated energy, but for this conversation, we're just focusing on the housing level, the property level energy production. Fourth are embodied energy reduction. So many of the materials that we use in our homes, particularly any kind of cement and steel, are very carbon intensive, and it's very challenging to make them less carbon intensive. To this group, I would add the hydrofluorocarbons that release more challenging greenhouse gas emissions that we use in our air conditioning. But I'm only going to speak directly to the top four and not about the embodied energy reductions, just for the sake of time in this conversation. And I'm presenting these in order of what I'd like to think of are the happy stories to the maybe not so happy stories about where we are equitably. So let's start off with electrification. So overall, it's generally a positive story with electrification. We still have a long way to go. For example, right now, only about 24% of homes have an electric heat pump in the entire country. This is across the entire housing stock. And if you look at the current housing stock by its age, we see massive increases, important increases every year over time of the introduction of heat pumps. So people are switching out their heat pumps. So if we look, for example, at a home that was built in 1970, in 2009, only about 9% of those homes had an electric heat pump. By 2015, that had gone up to about 8%. By 2015, that had gone up to 9%. By 2020, that's up to almost 14%. So as homes are aging and replacing their HVAC systems, they're actually replacing them out with these systems. So that's a good news story, right? That these specific systems are being switched out. I should also note that new homes are increasingly being built in with all electric. We have some places like Florida where 77% of new homes are all electric, and this is all due to a cost of a combination of the fact that these are more cost competitive technologies, due to also state and local policies, as well as industry adoption. Industry is able to switch these out in existing homes as well as implement them in new homes much more easily. But the slight grayness in the cloud, there's a slight cloud in the sky when it comes to the fact that still a good portion of new homes are also being built with fossil fuel access. So about 50% of new homes still have some natural gas connection. And so 2/3, even though this is diminishing over time, right? 2/3 of older homes have both electricity and another fuel, and it's going down to about 50%. Let's talk more good news, especially since I want to talk more about equity. And that is, in this case, that the share of homes by income group, adoption of things like electric heat pumps is actually fairly proportional. There isn't a huge disparity by income group within each group of adoption of this specific electrification technology. The same holds generally true for tenure and housing type. So on the right, you'll see all owners and all renters. The one blip here are multifamily owners. So those are condo owners. who may obviously be using different kinds of systems for their delivery because they're larger buildings. So more to be studied on that one. But generally, we're looking at a positive picture here. Let's go to the next intervention, and that's energy efficiency. Also more good news, and that is that their homes have become much more energy efficient over time. If we look just at different points in time in which the residential energy consumption survey was done, from 1978 to 2015, we see major reductions from almost 140 million BTUs on average were being consumed by homes in 1978 to the 77 million BTUs that we see today in construction. So that's good news that our homes, particularly obviously in our new homes, are becoming much more efficient. And the expenditures that we use have also been fairly consistent. They've gone up, particularly in the post-era American Recovery Act era. And we're talking about remodeling rates for switching for energy efficient improvements. So for example, there was a slight modest downturn in the last couple of years, 33.6% of remodeling projects were energy related 2015 compared to about the 27.5% in the past. And homeowners are making improvements for energy efficiency to an older and aging housing stock in this very sense that there's a lot of the older the houses are, the more likely they're going to be making these energy efficiency improvements. So that includes particularly roofing, HVAC, windows and doors, and exterior siding. And those remain the largest by far projects that are energy remodeling that have potential for energy benefits, and in that order. I do want to note, though, that the gray cloud in this picture is that low-income households remain severely underserved by energy-efficient programs and are less likely to be able to implement some of the more discretionary projects related to energy efficiency, though in replacements they are pretty much keeping up on their own. But that means that a lot of low-income households then rely on other aid programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program. And I encourage folks to look at an ACEEE study done in 2017, I believe it was, by Ariel Driebold. That was a study of utilities energy efficiency programs that found a concentration of programs in places that have extensive policymaking that encourages outreach and support to low-income households for their energy efficiency. But even in those places, her study showed that there was a modest per customer investment in low-income efficiency. Now let's move on to digitalization. So in the context of this energy inequity, we don't see an even diffusion of energy digitalization. So we're starting to get to the less happy portion of our energy equity story. 13% of American homes have a smart or interconnected thermostat. And I pick thermostats in this case for digitalization because it's the most diffused of all digitalization technologies in American homes, with the possible exception of utilities smart meters. So you would own your programmable thermostat, but you don't own your utility meter. That's owned by the utility. And right now, about 2/3, 65% of homes in the United States have these, even though most people don't know that their utility meter may be a smart meter. And that is reading on a real-time basis how much energy your entire home is consuming. 50%, so let's go back to the programmable thermostat. So where I said 13% of American homes have a smart thermostat. What that means is a thermostat that can read how much energy is being produced, as well as know how much energy is taken off the grid, so that it can be programmed to essentially manage and be smart about energy uses. 52% of American homes have a programmable thermostat. That means the occupant can set what temperature she wants her home to be. These are very different technologies, but when we look at who controls what, who has access to what, we clearly see that higher income households are more likely to be able to have the smart or internet connected thermostat, and they're certainly more likely to have a programmable thermostat. So this increases, for example, let me give us some numbers to this. 73% of households with incomes over 140 annual income report having a programmable thermostat, and 7% have smart thermostats. In contrast, if you look at households with incomes less than about 20,000, they report having these controls at rates of 37% and 1%, respectively. So larger and newer homes as well, as single-family homes are more likely to have installed this specific digitalization technology compared to their peers. So when we talk about digitalization, we must ask, who does digitalization benefit? One group of researchers has referred to digitalization technologies as early adopter toys for wealthier households more than they are an effective energy management tool. In fact, most utilities have advocated for digitalization because of demand and response management, that is being able to offer variable rates for use at different times of the day. So at peak energy use low times, they'll charge more, and they'll be able to know how much energy you're using at those specific times. There's an important disclaimer around here as well, and that is that that ability to do demand response management that is enabled by digitalization technologies is confusing for a lot of low-income households. For example, once they know that their home has a smart meter, or maybe they don't know, and after the smart meter is installed, I should say, and demand response management is allowed by their state's public utility commissions, several folks, including those observed by Diana Hernandez for her qualitatively for her research, noted that they had no idea why their bill was going up, because they were using the same amount of energy during peak load times as they had in the past, and nobody had explained to them, or they didn't understand what it meant. So consumers don't understand this, and certainly those without the resources, education, and bandwidth are even more put out. This also holds true with how we use these technologies. So an interesting thing about programmable thermostats and smart technologies is that unless you know how to program them, how to use them, and what they're being used for, you won't be receiving any of the energy benefits. And certainly the grid won't know the benefits of what you're trying to do. So a vast majority of people still are using things, exhibiting behaviors like turning off their thermostat on and off as needed, or manually adjusting the temperature, rather than allowing the programmable or smart thermostat to automatically adjust the temperature on its own. In many cases, some people just leave it at one temperature and leave it there most of the time. Unfortunately, this is also not evenly distributed these behaviors aren't evenly displayed or performed by income. And again, this issue of who has the bandwidth to understand, who has the technology, first off, and then who has the bandwidth to understand and be able to program these things. So I encourage, I'm dropping a lot of names while I'm talking because I think they're a great group of folks, and hopefully Therese Peffer from the California Institute for Energy and Environment at UC Berkeley is on, who's doing some really cutting edge work on behaviors and the use of these specific technologies. But ultimately, let's remember that a lot of folks don't have the luxury to alter their load times or don't understand it, why utilities have installed the smart meters for this very purpose. So I should note that I presented an earlier version of this that should be coming out from the Joint Center for Housing Studies Symposium on digitalization. And during the conversations, there was more than one Harvard University professor who told me that they manually turn on and off their thermostat. So there's a lot more work that has to happen in digitalization. The last physical intervention I want to talk about is on this distributed renewable energy sources. And again, the primary issue here is that newer homes, there's still a very small percentage of homes that have solar PV, for example. We're only talking about 2.8% of all homes. And they tend to be newer homes. They almost always are single family owned homes and single family detached homes, and easily among wealthier households only. So very quickly, who will do this work? So there, of all these interventions, we talked just about 4 of them in detail, but there are a lot of folks who are going to be demanding this. So who does this? Since the American Recovery Act back in 2009, we know that there's been a lot of talk about green jobs, but ultimately those jobs fell on the same occupations and the same establishments. that have traditionally filled these roles. And we're talking about your local remodeler, your HVAC repair person, your window installer, your roofer, going to your local hardware store, or as well as your Home Depots and your Lowe's. So while there are tremendous opportunities for in the policies programs that I'll be talking about in a second for apprenticeships and job promotions, starting those programs now will yield skilled trades, women and men 4 to 5 years from now. So there's still a wide ranging group of people that we have to start focusing on. And the majority of these establishments tend to be small with only a handful of employees. In fact, the average number of employees across remodeler establishments is 3.4. It's also important to note that the workforce that would be providing, doing this work in those establishments is also increasingly tight. There are huge gaps in that workforce in filling them in the long term. The construction industry has consistently had an increasing scale of openings over the last several decades that preceded the pandemic. The construction workforce is also largely male and white, also more Hispanic and more foreign born, and slightly older than the overall industry. So if you look just at HVAC installers, which will be a critical player in ensuring that people get heat pumps, for example, only 1.5% of that workforce are women and 25% are Hispanic. I would be remiss if I didn't just talk about workforce and also talk about supply chain issues, but I will just quickly say, using, for example, CBRE's 2022 construction cost trends, that we know that energy related materials, that all of the materials that are necessary and the equipment that are necessary for a lot of the interventions that we talked about have had serious delivery challenges over the last 2 years. Roofing installation, for example, takes about 40 to 50 weeks to deliver in this past year, and that's a 667% increase over 2 years before. HVAC equipment takes about 36 to 50 weeks to deliver to get on site, and of course we all have experience. If you bought an appliance over the pandemic, you know that it takes about 20 to 30 weeks now to have those appliances delivered on site. So this is what you've been waiting for. Let's talk a little bit about IIJA and IRA. Before I do that, though, it's absolutely critical that I mention that there have been a wide group of people that have been invested in energy efficiency, electrification, and positive energy improvements since the 1970s. And so we're going back to the federal research programs that were DOE, the interventions from HUD and EPA, particularly Energy Star and awareness programs. These are and all of these organizations supportive national appliance standards. These are the unsung heroes in the move towards equitable energy interventions, and certainly the Justice 40 requirements that are being considered by these agencies is going to play a critical role in the next decade. But there are also lots of great national advocacy organizations, research and service groups, and national housing intermediaries who played a critical role in this. So it's both I want to make sure that we're looking at that right-hand side in particular when we're talking about the energy groups and the housing groups that have coalesced and been doing a lot of this great advocacy work. And there are specific civil sector organizations like Elevate Energy and the Association for Energy Affordability that have been actually on the ground trying to ensure equitable transitions across all of these interventions. So I hat tip to all of you. But I do want to talk a little bit more about how this has built up some of the positive changes that we've seen over time in the last 3 decades of improved energy efficiency, increased electrification, because they serve as a model where we need to go. And starting off with, of course, building codes, and it's no shock that building codes for new homes and applying standards that can be used for new and existing homes have been promulgated nationally. And there are many state and local mandates and incentive programs that have accelerated this. For example, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where my colleagues are sitting now, there are stretch codes that are no longer based on energy requirements, but are now increasingly on carbon performance of housing, so that go beyond construction specifications. The challenge with the focus on new construction and building codes is the extensive increase in construction costs, which in turn could yield unaffordable housing overall, and the transfer of lower income households to the more inefficient existing stock. And also, we need to address the overwhelming consumption from the building sector that continues to come from this existing stock. Yet only a handful of state and local policies and policy interventions have focused on that existing stock. There are some places that have benchmarking that tends to apply only to multifamily housing stocks. Folks in New York City and due to local law 97 are probably most familiar with this. There are a couple of small examples, two examples to note in small cities in the last year, Ithaca, New York, and Menlo Park, California, that have required carbon neutrality in all of their housing stock in 2030. That means mandatory retrofits of all housing. And there, of course, has been more concerted effort on the appliance side by state and locals, in addition to national appliance standards. For example, California just recently prohibited natural gas heating equipment beginning in 2030. California has also set goals for the installation of heat pumps and set aside funds for this very effort for low-income households. So there are a lot of great new initiatives. Most of these are still in early development phase or early execution phase. And so the implementation of these are things that we're waiting to see. But here's the real game changer, the IIJA and IRA. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed last year, and the Inflation Reduction Act passed this year. I should note, and I want to repeat this, and I repeat this in every opportunity I have, that there were originally over $150 billion assigned to housing that would come out of the Build Back Better proposals. And that isn't manifested in the IIJA or the IRA. So to really focus on the energy transition, we have to support that kind of housing investment as well. But let's talk about the IIJA. Certainly, there are $3.5 billion for WAP, as well as additional funds for state energy programs, and the energy efficient and conservation block grants are important. On the IRA side, the biggest pots of money are for the $4.3 billion for the homes grants. That's the homeowner managing energy savings grant program, which are rebates that state energy offices will procure to individual households, and this goes up to $2,000 to $4,000 rebate per unit, depending on the level of savings, doubled for the low to moderate income households. The other program is of course the high efficiency electric home rebates program, which is catered to a slightly higher income bracket, the 80% to 150% AMI, area median income. I'd like to get into the whole scope of all of these, but I realize I'm conscious of running out of time. But you see some of the projections for how many homes that will be served by these different programs through the Rocky Mountain Institute, as you said that on the screen. But there is a real concern that there are going to be a lot of people. One, this is a good chunk of change. It's going to get us move the ball forward for equity in energy transformation, but it's only going to take us part of the way there. A core concern, even in those homes that we see that are projected to be saved, is the fact that there's a wide opportunity for people to slip through these cracks, starting with the income eligibility requirements, with WAP being the weatherization assistance program being up to 200% of poverty level, the rebate eligibility being about 80 to 120% of area median income, and then the tax credits being above that. And then the costs of these different technologies are obviously going to be play out in how much any individual low-income household can afford, unless the rebate covers all of the costs. The costs are important because we also know that many of the IIJA and IRA rules that are being rolled out also include Davis-Bacon requirements, which in a lot of cases are going to increase the cost of the individual project that a homeowner will be able to take up. So sort of shrinking the amount of benefits of the individual homeowner or occupant. There are also lots of anecdotes that I could talk about in terms of what electrifying without efficiency and what digitalization without educational awareness could mean. But I want to make sure that people understand that there are a lot of opportunities for implementation. DOE is releasing RFIs around these very rulemaking strategies now. So I encourage you to go out and look at those. Now, one question I didn't pose to all of you was when? When do we have to do this all? The challenges for ensuring, obviously, that the housing occupants can access all of these decarbonization resources and making sure that the housing industry can deliver it are very formidable. But we're on a pretty short timeline. The original goals that were committed to for the Paris goals and that the White House is currently committed to are 50 to 50% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030. That is in 8 years. This is across the entire carbon economy. So one would assume that an equal proportion would be shared by the building sector and the residential sector in particular. But ultimately, we're talking about net zero by 2050 and the residential sector being a prime vehicle for this to happen. So it's a generation's worth of time to undo almost 5 generations of the mass energy supply delivery that we have in the US homes that began in the 1880s. So I'll leave you with some thoughts about where we need to move forward, and that it's clearly that this is a decade of transformation, particularly on market transformation, because all of the policy programs that are ahead of us are for carrots. So we want to ensure that there's a diffusion of these interventions such that when we pass the 2030, 2035 timeline, we also have the opportunities to start, that the market starts taking up much of this work on its own. And that includes understanding what the physical problems are in the low-income housing stock and understanding the qualifications of what those household burdens are. Then making sure that we're combining appropriate intervention. So not just rushing to electrification without saying what the individual house and household needs. That means making sure that you have the eligibility, the scope, and the case management requirement changes and programs to be able to have that kind of flexibility. Also using many of the local civil sector organizations that we've talked about as intermediaries for many of these low-income households because they're trusted by local communities, as well as know how to communicate and educate and create awareness about these opportunities. I would be remiss to say that I know that there are major initiatives that were just announced this week regarding the opportunities to inform local communities with resource funding from philanthropy. That all of this has to happen in collaboration with industry to ensure speedy, quality, and affordable decarbonization as well. And there are parallel activities and have to make sure that R&D continues and that we have, at the end of the day, life cycle savings that benefit the pay per household, the actual low-income household and other disadvantaged community first before the owner, utility, and the provider. With that, I will end. I apologize, I probably went over time, so hopefully we have some time for questions.
Carlos, thank you. What an amazing sort of tour de force through just you know, I think obviously hugely important field, but also I appreciate the way you've brought pieces together. One thing you didn't talk about, and my memory is, I think, you know, in a recent blog that you wrote, you raised this point. You touched on it a little bit at the end, but one of the keys, you know, you talked about the labor force, but most of the work is going to be done by private sector remodelers, which is an industry that has some pretty interesting characteristics. But how do you think about creating, what do we need to put in place to create a system where people feel like they can trust? You know, this is, you know, we all, some of us are old enough to remember the movie Tin Men, right? You know, the great account of aluminum siding salesman in Baltimore. And, you know, we don't want that. We don't want people to just take advantage of folks. So can you talk a little bit about how you connect the industry and the people where the work's going to be done?
Sure. And it probably comes off in 2 prongs, right? One is the skill set, making sure that the organizations as well as the workforce know how to install something accurately so that it meets its energy potential, right? And that requires a lot of education, a lot of training in some cases. So to the extent that even more R&D can help make sure that that's a seamless process, so it's easy to install something, it's easy to the point where maybe even a DIYer could do it on their own. A very knowledgeable DIYer, I hope. That's an important scale. That's an important scale. And I mean, so much of the remodeling industry and the home building industry has done a better job of educating and making awareness within their sectors. And so I certainly would turn to a lot of the trade associations that are pushing a lot of this education and training. The second part is the ability to understand the paperwork side of it, right? If I am a remodeler and I have to ask for what kind of income verification to make sure that the rebate is going to the right household, those kinds of complications are going to make or break this program. And that's what DOE is struggling with right now, right? So that part has to be streamlined as much as possible so that it's easy, so that you're not encouraging fraud, but which I'm actually less worried about than poor installation than simply people taking a rebate because you can get this product for cheaper and for this specific community, and it maybe not be installed for the energy saving potential that we want it to. So I think that the paperwork side is what is being resolved right now. But I'd like to think that the education awareness side is moving along well, with the exception that we don't have enough workers in this industry.
We have any number of wonderful questions. If I guess I don't want to throw darts at my screen to pick one. It'd be bad. Probably force myself online. But there have been several kind of interesting questions around the point you were making about the very low level of adoption of smart thermostats in lower income households, and folks just kind of posing questions about how do we think about perhaps unlocking that. I don't know if you've thought about some particular policy approaches or working with other community groups that might be effective approaches.
Yeah, and we had a great conversation about that when we did the digitalization symposium, and I still can't say that word, by the way. But I think that what we came up with was the issue of trust being the primary concern, right? People trusting that. I think people at all bandwidths would be able to learn how to program a thermostat, right? If they knew how and knew the benefit of it. But they're not sure who really benefits from that intervention, right? Because so much of the intervention is being posed as cost saving for the utilities. So I think part of it is a trust issue with who is managing the technology. Educating people, I found that it's just tickling, right? That so many super educated people, Harvard professors, didn't know how to program their thermostats, right? Yet we all know how to use these things, right? So I think that there has to be a cultural change that's associated with this. And I haven't talked at all about that. I think that's true across all of the interventions that we're speaking about. There certainly are folks like the Building Decarbonization Coalition who have been talking about the culture of cooking heavily, and making sure that people know that they can actually cook on an induction stove or even on an regular electric stove without needing the health disadvantages of a natural gas stove. So I think that part of it is going to be a cultural change. So, but that's a bigger bite to swallow in one generation's worth of time.
I think this will be the last question. We'll probably go about 5 minutes longer than I had said, so we'll try and end this about 1:20. How do you think about, either from the homeowner perspective or a local or regional or state policymaker perspective, how do you think about going about the choice between, to what extent should I be focusing on energy efficiency? To what extent should I be focusing on electrification? To what extent should I be focusing on solar panels? And to what extent should I be saying, you know what I really want to do is change create just much more renewable energy, build more windmills, put up, solar farms. How do we think about making that balance?
So you hit the nail on the core problem, right? Because I presented these as separate interventions, when the reality is you need a combination of all of these in every house. The problem is a lot of the advocacy work that has gone into this is focused on one of the interventions. And programs, if my goal as a state is to electrify all of a sudden and not include energy efficiency in the product, you're going to have resulting negative outcomes for a lot of your, especially low-income households. So I always feel like the problem with the way most of these programs are set up is that we're not censoring the household and the housing in which they live. And if you do that, you're going to make sure that you have good case management for what should happen. You're going to have to do an energy audit. I should note IRA rebates allow for energy audit, which I'm telling everybody do that now. I mean, we'll do that when 2023 comes around, so you can get the rebate for it. But those are absolutely critical ways of thinking about what you should do in your house that best meets your house and your household's needs. And that's the most important thing. That I would never say that none of these five will work separately. I mean, they're all going to be good, but you need to think about them all in interaction. The only other side note I would say is that in some cases, particularly for the solar, for the renewable distributed, that is highly dictated by state policy. In many cases, it's actually more cost effective and more certainly energy productive to have utility scale renewables, which is why you may be charged a premium by your utility if you choose to offer to have that service rather than property level. But I wouldn't, for those who can afford and where it's technologically viable to have property level or community level distributed energy, we should be promoting that. It has to be all of the above. This is the one case where I would agree in energy conversations that it is all of the above.
And just got an interesting one in. Let's assume that we're really successful and we decarbonize, fingers crossed. What has to happen to our electric? Can the electrical grid? Can we generate and distribute enough power, or do we need to be making sure there's some sort of a parallel investment so we don't wind up looking like Texas a couple of winters ago?
Correct. That is the biggest concern if we do mass electrification very quickly. And the current grid is not prepared remotely close, which is why so much of the IRA is actually, I mean, the $9 billion compared to the scale of the IRA and IIJA investment is tiny, right? I mean, housing, we can get a lot done. All the housers in the room know that we can get a lot done with a little bit amount of money in the housing space. Much of the money is going to incentivize utilities to do property level, as well renewable, as well as transmission and siting changes. The problem is then that's two additional problems, right? Making sure that switch out happens timed well with as individual properties are electrified over on the overall grid, which is why digitalization is important, because you can manage where the grid is, if it can power to. But it also means that there is going to be more asks of our built environment, of our communities, because we have to have more transmission and more siting of transmission in our communities beyond what we currently have for electricity. So you're going to see
that's easy. That's not a problem at all.
Yeah. Those of us in the housing space know, oh yeah, land use, that's not a problem at all.
Again, I really want to thank you for a huge tour de force, and I really love your framing, and I think those of us who care about this set of issues you talked about would do well to remember the framing, which started with kind of, well, what problem are we trying to solve? Making sure we took its equity implications, into account, look across the range of possible solutions. But I've certainly, over the time we've been working together, really learned a lot also from your focus of saying, well, who's going to do the work? How's it actually going to get done? That sort of implementation, and the very thick set of problems that come from establishing, getting homeowners to do this, because it's all of us or the owners of rental properties. It's just a very decentralized system, and then finding the folks to do the work and relationships that work. As you recall, one of the reasons we scheduled this now was because the Remodeling Futures program is doing all kinds of fascinating work on this, as I mentioned in my intro, and then you mentioned. Stay tuned. There are some papers and blogs coming out, and then as we both mentioned, there'll be a really, I think, nice summary of some of this work again in the Improving America's Housing Report, which will come out in late March. I'm sure we'll have you back in the Housing Research Seminar. I want to thank you. I want to thank all the folks who put in questions. I want to thank Sophia Wadeen and Abby Will for helping monitor the questions and flagging issues, and of course for the great work that they have done. Hope everybody has a great day. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, David. Have a good weekend, everyone.